Module 1 of U.S. History 1302, we're going to cover chapters 15 and 17, Reconstruction and the West. So, our first chapter, we're covering Reconstruction, takes place after the end of the Civil War. The North has won. Abraham Lincoln has just been assassinated. And so we are trying to rebuild the Union. We're trying to decide what to do with all the former slaves, but unfortunately, there's a lot of disagreement. This first term that we have, the 13th Amendment, that was passed shortly before Abraham Lincoln's death, but it was not ratified until the end of the year 1865. It will become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Prohibit slavery except for punishment for crime. This will free 4 million slaves across the U.S. If you remember from the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but that only freed slaves in the southern United States, in the former Confederacy. It did not free the slaves that were still in the North, were in the slave states that remained loyal, those border states like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware. So, and there was also even the ones that they had captured, they called them contraband, and we're not sure what to do with the slaves that had been captured from the South. So this was the end that said, okay, well, now all the slaves are free in the entire US. And the only way that you can put somebody to work without paying them is if they commit a crime, which unfortunately the South will take advantage of very soon. We also, of course, know that after the end of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson will become president after Lincoln's assassination. Johnson was a Southern Democrat. He was pro states' rights and very close to a lot of former Confederates. And so, pretty much as soon as he took over, he threw out Lincoln's Reconstruction plan and implemented one that was much nicer to the Confederates. In fact, on Christmas, he will pardon basically all former Confederate officers and generals. And unfortunately, this means that they can get back into office and they'll pretty much immediately begin to roll back any advancements that have been done by the Republicans and by the new state legislatures and in the South. He will fight very much with the Republicans in Congress, especially the radical Republicans. They wanted to implement more laws to make things more equal in the South. He will actually be the first president ever in U.S. history to be impeached. So, this is something that's in our Constitution that allows us to remove a person in office who's done something wrong. It has to be first in the House. They basically have to say, we think he's done something wrong, and they have to get the majority of the House to agree. Then it goes to the Senate, where they will have to vote and decide whether the president has done this thing. And basically, if he is convicted in the Senate, then he will be removed from office. All right, for Module 1 of U.S. History 1302, we are going to start with Reconstruction, and then we're going to move into Chapter 17, which is the West. So, our first set of terms are going to be the 13th Amendment, Andrew Johnson, and the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is important because it frees the slaves. This was done basically after the Civil War is over, just before Lincoln's assassination. This is passed by Congress and will be ratified later that year. It will free all slaves in the United States, regardless of their being in the North or the South, which is different from the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves in the South, in the Confederacy. Our next term, Andrew Johnson, this is Lincoln's former vice president. After Lincoln's assassination in 1865, he will become president. Now, Lincoln, when he was running for re-election in 64, wanted to have sort of this unifying candidacy. So he, instead of picking another Republican for his running mate, like normally would do, He picked a Democrat because he wanted to create something a little more unified and try to help bring the country back together, even though the southern half was currently at war with the northern half. But unfortunately, after his assassination, Johnson threw out all of Lincoln's Reconstruction plans that heavily emphasized equality and forcing the Confederacy to accept these new rules and accept equality. And he will end up pardoning most Confederates, which unfortunately allows them to get back into government and get back to office, which they had been banned from before. He will also fight very heavily with Republicans in Congress who want to create a more just and equal society. And eventually, the fighting gets so bad, they decide to impeach him, and he will become the first president in U.S. history to be impeached. And so that's where the House of Representatives rules by majority that the president has done something that believes he should be removed from office. But after being passed in the House, it has to go to the Senate. And in the Senate is where they decide whether or not the president will actually be removed from office. And that takes a two-thirds majority. And so far, we've had four impeachments, but no president has been removed from office. Our next term, Black Codes. This is what happens after the Confederates are pardoned by Johnson and they're allowed to get back into government. They immediately begin trying to roll back some of the rights that African Americans have gotten in the South. So they try to limit the rights. They also pass vagrancy laws. And basically, anytime a black person who is seen outside of their home, not working or doing anything they look that was suspicious, basically criminalize black leisure, they could be arrested and then immediately sent out to go work. That's why black codes are basically called slavery by another name, because they would, arrest them, convict them of some crime, and then they would have to work for free again. Sometimes on plantations for former slave owners. So even though we'd fought this war, we'd gotten them free, and they were supposed to be, now becoming more equal. Unfortunately, these former Confederates came in and put them back into these extremely uh, very similar situations because they convicted them of crimes thanks to these black codes. They also took away the rights to vote of many of them, and it led a lot of slaves to only be able to work on farms. And a lot of these farms had very unfair practices. And they were basically, again, stuck in something that was very akin to the slavery they had supposedly just been freed from. Now, at the time, Republicans held a vast majority of Congress, and so they were able to pass another law. This was known as the 14th Amendment. This is a change to the Constitution. Again, they're amending the Constitution in 1866 to provide birthright citizenship. So if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen with equal rights. And so this overrided the Black Codes, which again only applied to African Americans. And it was ratified 2 years later in 1868. This meant that they could no longer target somebody just because of their race. And everybody is supposed to have equal protection under the law. And on this, you see some examples. You have 13th Amendment ratified. You see the breaking of chains. You have this sign, no loitering, standing, drinking, sitting near property, police orders. Again, this was one of those things where if a person of color, especially someone who was black, was basically loitering, then they could be arrested for vagrancy. It was, again, very, very unfair implementation of the law, but that, again, was meant to basically force them back into slavery. You also have, of course, segregation across the South, but also in the North and some places as well. So you end up with places for white people and places for African Americans being separate versus bathroom, restaurants, stores, even water and drinking fountains, which is why you can see a man drinking from a segregated fountain here. You also have Pictures of Andrew Johnson. He was not a popular president from the Democrats or the Republicans. So he was quite derided in the national media, which is why you have this picture of him here crying because they overrode his veto in Congress. Our next four terms are Ulysses S. Grant, Black office holders, Freedmen Bureau, and Black schools and churches. So in 1868, Andrew Johnson is does not run for president again, and the Democrats don't want him, and so you have another Democrat run, but he ends up losing to the Republican candidate, and this Republican candidate is going to be Ulysses S. Grant. If you remember from the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant was the Union general that helped win the war. And so he was a very, very popular candidate. And his whole presidential campaign was let us have peace. We have all this infighting, we have all this, problems happening. And so we are going to work to try to make things a little bit more peaceful. And I mean, the war's been over for 3 years now, but we're still having basically terrorist attacks and murders and killings and lynchings and fights happening in the South. And so he will end up winning, and he will send the military in to occupy the South to force this equality and to try and actually make sure that we are holding up to our promises. And those promises are only held up after Grant becomes president and we send in the military to occupy the South. And so from 1868 onward until the end of Reconstruction, the South will be occupied by the North. And a lot of these formerly elected slaveholders and Confederate officers and soldiers will be removed from office. And once again, African Americans will be able to vote in their own governors and mayors and legislators. And so that leads us into our next one, Black office holders. As soon as the African American population in the South was able to vote, they started electing a ton of Black office holders. There's a ton at the state level. There are Black controlled mayors and city councils. There's even two senators at the national level and 14 congressmen in the House, and over 800 state legislatures across the southern states. Because remember, there were millions of slaves in the South. They didn't quite outnumber the slave holders and non-white people in the South, but there were still a great deal of them, and they had a lot of power. And so by appealing to that, Grant was able to get a nice victory. But also, once they were able to vote, they were able to start voting in a lot of Black politicians, and you started to see a little bit more equality. You also have the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was supposed to help freed slaves adjust and also try to handle some of the fighting going on between slaves and former slaves and their masters. But unfortunately, it was not very successful. And one of the original promises made to slaves when they were freed by General Sherman was 40 acres and a mule, which was never met. So, this idea being that after slaves are finally freed, after they've been working their entire life for free, basically, they should get something in exchange to help them get started. And so the promise was to take 40 acres and a mule from their former slave master. But unfortunately, that did not happen. Thanks to the end of slavery and the freedom that had been offered to them during Reconstruction, African Americans were able to create their first churches and their first communities without any sort of oversight from the white slave owners, the white overseers. Because after, if you remember, Nat Turner's rebellion, where he was a black preacher who was believed that he received a message from God to go kill the slave owners and start a slave revolt. They no longer allowed independent black worship. They also worked hard to prevent any sort of education, especially after high-profile slaves like Frederick Douglass became educated by his slave master and then used his education and his knowledge to run away and then spend his entire life speaking out against slavery. They absolutely did everything they could in the South to limit access to knowledge and access to any sort of community for the slaves without the watchful eye of the slave owner. And so now that that was over, you had these black schools and churches that became very important um, communities for these newly freed slaves. And you had this massive movement of people down to the South, especially of white women, to come down and teach, because, of course, this was a time where teaching was almost exclusively a profession of white women. Unless, of course, it was a religious school, then you would probably have a male teacher. On the top left, you can see some black congressmen that were elected to our national legislature during this time. And of course, you have a couple pictures of Ulysses S. Grant, including the one on the right, which is his presidential photo. On the left, you have bottom left, you have the image of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was again supposed to be this person coming from the federal government to kind of, separate the slaves and the slave owners and try to keep the peace and help them establish. But unfortunately, they pretty much failed on every goal that they had. As far as the large ones go, there might have been a few personal successes and some small successes, but they really did not live up to their mission. And you also have a picture here of, again, a white woman coming down to the South to help educate these young children. Now that black children were able to actually receive an education. And you also have the first Congregational Church, Atlanta, Georgia, one of the first black churches opened up in Atlanta. The next four terms are the American Equal Rights Association, the National Women's Suffrage Association, the 15th Amendment, and the Ladies Memorial Associations. So, our first one, this was a combination of white and black people who came together to fight for um, suffrage. Now, when we hear the word suffrage, we might think of something else. We might think of something bad, but it is an older term that simply meant the ability to vote. So, in this instance, American Equal Rights Association was a combination of abolitionist groups. Remember, abolitionist groups were fighting for the end of slavery. Now that that had been achieved, the question on a lot of people's mind was, what do we do next? We have freed the slaves. Now we've given them equality under the law. But not everywhere in the country can they vote. So the American Equal Rights Association had a huge debate. Should we fight for black suffrage, so the suffrage for the recently freed slaves, or should we fight for universal suffrage? Now, if you remember, there was a women's rights group. You have the Seneca Falls Convention for about 30 years before this in the 1840s, and they were trying to advocate for women to get the right to vote. There was a lot of overlap in these organizations fighting for both women's rights and abolition. After it was over, they tried to come together and work for the future, but not everybody agreed. Some people wanted just suffrage for African American men, but uh, women's rights leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought that it should be universal. Everybody should get the right to vote, men and women of all races. And so that debate eventually led to it being dissolved in 1870 after the 15th Amendment was passed. So the 15th Amendment is important because it finally removes race as a barrier to vote. So again, it makes it to where you can vote no matter what your race is. You can't ban a certain race. You can't ban African Americans from voting. You can't ban Mexican Americans from voting, Asian Americans, etc. But Unfortunately for women's rights leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it did not do anything for women's rights. So, the 15th Amendment will remove race as a barrier for voting, but makes no mention of sex or gender. Whereas the 14th Amendment had introduced the word male for the first time, saying that all men should be equal under the law and receive the right to vote. But then there was still some question in certain places where they tried to limit the right to vote for African Americans, but now this specifically said African Americans have the right to vote. But unfortunately, again, those same places that had tried to fight in the old Confederacy this equality will introduce what's known as Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow laws covers pretty much everything that was done to limit racial equality. So this is poll taxes, literacy tests, segregation laws, all of these in the South. This will unfortunately happen after the end of Reconstruction later in the 1870s. And it will not be until the 1960s that a lot of these Jim Crow laws are gotten rid of, but we'll go into those in a little bit later. Our next term, the National Women's Suffrage Association, after the dissolving of the American Equal Rights Association, the some of the leaders of the women's rights movement will form the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA, specifically Susan B. Anthony and Stanton. In this instance, they fought for the right to vote for women, claiming that actually women already had the right to vote. And so they will actually push women to register to vote anyway. Susan B. Anthony will actually vote or like get registered to vote and try to vote and be arrested for it. The case for women's right to vote will go all the way to the Supreme Court in 1875. And they will basically say, okay, women are citizens, so you have some rights, but you can't vote. The right to vote only belongs to men. It's also unfortunately at this point that some women's rights leaders started pushing the woman's vote as a way to counter the black vote, because now you again have all these former slaves that are now free and voting, at least the men are. But again, you still have a larger population where because there are more white women at this time than there are free black slave men. And so Canton basically started saying, hey, white women could counter this heavily black Republican vote, especially white women in the South, trying to get more people to join this cause. Whether that was effective or not is not really sure. It will still be another 50 years almost before women get the right to vote. The next one, Ladies Memorial Associations. These popped up all over the South after the war was over. The Confederacy had lost the war, and you had a lot of these Southern white women who wanted to honor their fallen brothers, fathers, husbands, etc. But in addition to burying the dead, they also began to do a little things a little bit more insidious. They began to push this idea that the war wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. They also heavily tried to de-emphasize the brutality of slavery. It's like, no, slaves saw the slave owner as more like a father figure, not a brutal master who would beat them if they didn't do what he wanted them to do and treat them horribly and inhumanely. It was for their own good. If they need to be, African Americans need to be slaves. They need to be controlled. They need that guidance, and that's what we were providing for them. It wasn't so that we could get free labor and make a ton of money off of them, of course. And they started heavily emphasizing this idea of Southern nationalism. Of course, there had been no such thing prior to 1861 when the war started, but now they called back to this antebellum South. Antebellum means pre-Civil War. Um, and eventually they'll start pushing this sort of what becomes known as the lost cause. Again, pushing this idea that the South before the Civil War was this sort of paradise and wonderful thing, and this amazing culture of gentlemanly men and very, feminine women who all lived honorable, just lives until the main angry Northern people came in and took away and destroyed their society to force their ways upon them. And of course, the South did nothing wrong. So eventually, they will even begin to exert control over the education in the South. Some of the first textbooks to introduce this lost cause narrative came out in Georgia, which heavily emphasized what's known as this lost cause narrative. That again, it was a good thing that we were fighting for in the South. It was a good thing we were fighting for in the in the Civil War. It was states' rights. It wasn't slavery, which of course it was. So here you see a wagon. This is a suffragette wagon. They would basically be traveling all over the country, and they would be covered in slogans and handing out pamphlets about why women should get the right to vote. You also have a couple of members of the Women's Suffrage Association. They love to wear sashes. Their colors were usually is interested in this flag, uh, purple and yellow. And you have Susan B. Anthony pictured there, of course, probably the most well-known suffragette. And again, this was at a time before, radio and TV and everything. So this is the way that you traveled around the country sharing information, especially because you were trying to fight. And they were fighting for equal pay even back in the 1860s, and the Equal Pay Act wasn't even passed until the 1960s. So this is something, women's rights has always been something that we've been fighting for in this country. And of course, women still don't have equal pay today, with white women getting paid 75 cents and Hispanic and black women getting paid even less compared to white men. The other image is of a black man voting. These are former slaves. You even see a black Union soldier there going to vote for the first time. And as we mentioned, those ladies' memorial associations, the Daughters of the Confederacy, will end up, in addition to rewriting history and burying the dead, they will also create Confederate monuments like this one to our Confederate dead. Of course, in recent years, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding these. A lot of these statues have been torn down, but I will say a little bit of a trigger warning for anyone. If you do not like seeing depictions of dead bodies or racial violence, there is a unfortunate image of a lynched man on the next slide. So our next term is racial violence. This is unfortunately going to be very, very common over the next several decades in the South, especially as those who were in the previous power position do not like these changes, do not like this equality coming to the South for African Americans. And so they will do everything they can to try to fight back against it, mostly through violence. So, again, in the antebellum period, they're trying to get back to that. They really liked this whole, that's weird looking. I don't like it. So, again, they really were not feeling very good about this new paradigm, this new existence. And so they'll do everything they can, including killing and lynching and destruction of basically anything that African Americans had done to try to gain more equality. Here in the top right, you have an image of them of burning a schoolhouse meant for black children. You have multiple attacks on black villages and neighborhoods, which is one of them is depicted in the bottom left. But of course, probably the most remembered and unfortunately incredibly common way is that there would be these black lynchings. And these lynchings could happen for pretty much almost any reason. And again, these are going to be extrajudicial. So when somebody is lynched, they have not been convicted of a crime. They have not had gone before a jury. It is just a bunch of people have decided this person needs to die. And unfortunately, that's usually backed up by racial violence and in a way is meant to try to make the other people who are of that race scared. And again, a lot of this violence is all about keeping these people in their place. They may not be slaves anymore, but they are still considered lesser by many people in the South. You also have probably one of the most interesting uh, acts of racial violence, organized racial violence, is going to be when an African American city council and mayor are overthrown in North Carolina by a white mob, and they put in place a new city government because they just could not stand the idea of being led by a majority African American city council and having an African American mayor. And unfortunately, um, despite his promises to let us have peace and to send troops into the South to maintain to try to maintain peace and maintain equality, Grant will basically do nothing. Unfortunately, a lot of his promises come to naught. And so, under the Grant administration, racial violence will explode across the South. And nowhere is that more evident than the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, which is our next term, also known as the KKK. Originally founded in Tennessee in 1866, by 1868, it has spread to every Confederate state. There are Confederates in every state in the South. Originally, the Ku Klux Klan was led by members of the former slave owner class. These are plantation owners. These are the people at the top of society in the South. They ran the government, they ran the society, they had all the money and all the slaves. And after the war was over, they lost all of that. So they weren't happy about it. Eventually, the former slave owners, started working with eventually these former slave owners started working with criminal gangs and even guerrilla groups of former Confederate soldiers who basically refused to stop fighting even after the war was over. And they started terrorizing former slaves and attacking and killing not only former slaves, but even the ones who tried to fight them. They tried to kill the teachers and the people who came down to help them learn to vote and advance their society in any way. So they attacked Freedmen's Bureau members. In the bottom right, you can see an image from basically this is a cartoon, and these people had come down to try to help African Americans vote. And they said, basically, if you come here, we're going to kill you. So they were not above killing white people either, who they also considered race traitors, of course, because they were helping out the other race. And one of the worst acts of violence. You'll have 30 black Mississippians will be drowned in a mass murder in the 1860s. You also have dozens of black Republican and white Republican politicians assassinated because, again, they're trying to return things to the way they are, and they'll basically kill anybody who gets in the way. And unfortunately, as I said, Grant will not do anything to stop this, and it will continue on until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. Now, after all of this, a lot of these former slaves basically say, we're not going to achieve equality in a mixed society. So basically, we're going to go out and we're going to create our own places to live. We're going to find a place separate from the indignities of segregation and the violence, and we will hopefully be better off on our own. And so these people started creating black towns, which is our next term. One of them was Mound Bayou, Mississippi, established in 1887 by two former slaves, Isaiah Montgomery and Ben Green. All businesses, all properties, all farms, banks, everything in that town was owned by African Americans. And so it was only in these towns that they could feel equal, that they could feel like they weren't being exploited or taken advantage of or treated as second class citizens. And one of the main things that a lot of people in these places tried to escape from, of course, is a practice known as sharecropping, which is our next term. Basically, these white plantation owners who'd lost their wealth because of the war and now lost their slaves, they instead would break up their plantations into smaller plots and basically tell these former slaves, like, hey, come work this farm and I'll let you have your own house and your own little bit of land, but you're going to farm my land for me. And unfortunately, because a lot of these slaves were poorly educated, many didn't know how to read, they would be stuck in these sharecropping contracts, sometimes basically indefinitely. So again, even though slavery is supposed to be over, you still have all these white, rich, powerful slave owners basically trying to bring it back in a new way. And so again, a lot of people wanted to get away from that, and that's why they went to black towns. And of course, pretty much everywhere in the South and even some places in the North, you had segregation. But when everything is owned by black business owners and everything is run by black people, then they know at least in this town I am equal, and at least in this town I don't have to, go sit in the black lunch counter, go sit at the black, go use a black restroom or a black colored black fountain. Our next term is Republican economic policy. So, one of the reasons why the North was so successful in the Civil War was because they mostly represented the North. North at this time was very industrialized. They had railroads, telegraphs, factories, trains, and all this stuff that was the beginning of our modern manufacturing society, and it made the North much better prepared to fight the war, and was a big reason why the North won. And so, after after the war was over, you have our next term, Republican economic policy. Now, one of the reasons why the North was so successful was the fact that prior to the Civil War, the North had begun industrializing. They'd begun building factories. They had trains and telegraphs and railroads stretched all across the North, which allowed them to move people and resources a lot faster. And so instead of relying on something like slavery, we had begun to have basically our modern wage system, which at the time was termed as free labor. And it doesn't mean you work for free. It means you are free to work. You are free to work at this job. You're free to leave that job and move somewhere else. And so, something that existed for a long time was apprenticeships and jobs where you basically, instead of, you wouldn't be like today where you apply for a job, you get a job, you get paid for those wages. You would have contracts, you would have apprenticeships, you would have basically agreeing to work for years to learn a craft, to learn a skill, or you'd work little jobs here and there and try to earn enough for you to get your own farm or your own business or something else. And so this modern thing that we have today with wages and the ability to move jobs and things like that and having to apply for jobs is a relatively new system. This has not been the norm for very long. And so after the North won, they were like, hey, we're gonna move this down to the South. Now that they no longer have slaves, they can have our, system of free labor. And again, it helped that, of course, many Republicans were industrialists. The Republican Party has always been the party of big business and industrial centers and industrial power. And so they will go and try to spread that to the South. We're going to bring free labor to the South and let them do for wages. Um, but as we mentioned, the South was not really into that whole idea, especially when it came to letting African Americans have that equality. And so the exportation of free labor will not really or not really take on in the South in most places because they're much more interested in trying to maintain the status quo and having these very unfair practices of sharecropping and other exploitations. Which is why, unfortunately, the South will not really industrialize until after World War II, 1944, the 1940s. And it's not even until the late 1900s, the late 20th century, that the South begins to really grow in population and become a place growing in jobs and becoming a place where a lot of people move, um, like places like Texas and Florida and Georgia now are growing in some of the largest growing states, but back then they were not. And it was just because there wasn't a lot of jobs there, there wasn't a lot of resources. And unfortunately for African Americans living in the South, they were kept extremely poor and exploited. And it's not until after World War II that they really move out, are able to move out in large, but also we begin to industrialize the South. And so our next term is the Redeemers. So these are Democrats who are basically trying to say, let's move on. Okay. We had the Confederacy, it failed. Let's try to get this Republican crap out of here. Let's get rid of this free labor ideas. Let's get rid of all these Republican governors. Let's end Reconstruction. We don't need these government troops here anymore. We don't need the North controlling us anymore. We need to redeem the South. And so they tried to distance themselves from white supremacy and the Confederacy. And they even hoped to try to win black votes away from Republicans, which is what this cartoon here represents. But however, black voters will remain steadily Republican up until FDR and the New Deal. The Redeemers will eventually win control over states like Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee, and they will end Reconstruction in those states basically by agreeing to everything the government has said about equality and getting the troops out. And then they began to roll back those rights and begin to put more limits and restrictions on African Americans living in those states. But the final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction came with the Depression of 1873. So, a depression is when the economy stops growing and it stops growing and even begins to shrink and shrink badly. And so throughout the entire 18th century, 1800s, the economy is on a constant, what we call a boom and bust cycle. So you'll have these periods of extreme growth and then it'll stop. And then you'll have extreme depressions. We used to even call them panics of 1873, because usually in places like stock markets and things like that, when somebody is like, "Hey, this business is losing out, this business is losing out of money. Hey, everybody's losing money. I should sell my stocks right now so that I don't lose more money than I've already lost." Well, then everybody goes, "Well, he's selling his stocks. I'm going to sell my stocks." And so then everybody sells their stocks, and then everybody's stocks go down, and then you have a panic, which can lead to a depression. And in 1873, this happens after J. Cook and Company Bank, which was one of the largest banks in the US at the time, had to declare bankruptcy in 1873, which is basically, we've taken on all this debt and we can't afford to pay it back. Sorry, you know. And so they have to basically request the government come in and try to help them out, take over, or whatever. But they're basically no longer able to operate as a business anymore until this bankruptcy is solved. And this happened because they were building the North Pacific Railway, which is part of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it eventually led to a bank run where people, again, are selling all their stocks off. They're also running to the banks to try to get their money out because in the olden days, if you had money in the bank and the bank failed, that money's gone. You're never getting it back. There's no insurance, there's no backup on the bank like it is today. And so people would try to call it's one of those things where when people are worried about their money in the bank, they're going to go pull their money out of the bank. But if enough people do it, the bank runs out of money and then everybody loses. And so this led to a shutdown of the New York Stock Exchange, factory layoffs, farm foreclosures, railroads went down, there were strikes, and things got so bad that in the next election, the Democrats were able to take control of the House. The Grant administration basically spent the rest doing even less than they had for the first part of the administration. Unfortunately, for all of his hope, for all of his popularity, unfortunately, Grant's administration ended up being very ineffectual and unable to handle the struggle of reuniting this country and then dealing with a major economic catastrophe on top of it. You also have a number of his officials involved in scandals. And so by the next presidential election, which was in 1876, the Republicans are not looking so good. And people have lost confidence in Grant. And so you also have a great deal of violence and intimidation going on in the South, which is limiting access to Black voters. And after the Depression in the election of 1874, the Democrats will gain control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. And so this basically means Grant is not able to do anything. People aren't happy. Black voters in the southern states and other things going on in the elections that are not so, and fraud, basically. You really have a lot of questions about the election. Who won? We don't know. Well, ballots have been messed up, and Black people weren't able to vote normally in the election in the South. And so, when that happens, the backup is that the House of Representatives picks the president. Well, the Democrats are in control of the House, so they get to pick who becomes the next president. Now, what ends up happening is the candidate who has the most, but not enough to win, is Rutherford B. Hayes. He is a Republican. And so what happened is after a little backroom negotiating, a little wheeling and dealing, Hayes is selected to be president, but in exchange, he must end Reconstruction, which they needed the Republican Senate to also agree to. And so that was the deal. And as you can see from this image, it is the deal with the devil. Because unfortunately, now that Reconstruction is over, the slaves in the South are completely on their own. And those people who have been fighting against this progress and fighting against equality will do everything they can to pull it back. And they will be successful until the 1960s, when we finally have the civil rights movement that brings that back. to where something much closer to where it's supposed to be. Though, of course, not perfect. All right, moving on to chapter 17. This is the second chapter in this module. This is Conquering the West. So, first thing to talk about the West is what does the West mean? Basically, for most of U.S. history, the West has meant anything on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, which is that big mountain range over in the eastern United States. As we developed as a country, it sort of moved. And then after we got to the Great Plains, so Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, that sort of area, it sort of jumped. And we skipped over a lot of the middle states and we started settling in California. And California really blew up in terms of population with the gold rush. There's also the Colorado gold rush. And there is also a gold rush in Canada and in Alaska, which is known as the Klondike Gold Rush. And so there's a lot of gold in the Alaska Yukon territory up at the, very top of the North American map. There's a lot of migration to the area, and you have just a ton of Americans moving up there trying to get gold. Of course, most don't. Most just end up dying, and so the Canadians are really tired of us coming in there and leaving a bunch of dead Americans. Also, they're fighting with First Nations peoples, which is the Canadian term for Native American, or First American. Prospectors also will not really care about the environment and deforest a bunch of places and kill local populations and construct a bunch of mine shafts and temporary shelters. And so the very quickly the Canadians will begin to limit who can come in. And also very quickly they run out of gold. And very, very few people get rich, which is common. Pretty much every gold rush, again, you have a bunch of people move in, very few people strike it rich, a few businesses and large organizations move in, take over the vast majority of it, and then they get all the money, and then it's over. And that's exactly what happens in the Klondike Gold Rush. Um, as I said, the West is kind of a constantly moving term, moving place. Culturally, when we think of the West, we think of course, cowboys and Indians and horses. Um, for most of civilization, it was just sort of seen as this untamed place where there's wildlife and nobody living. But of course, there's actually Native Americans living there and have been for 10,000 years. But whatever. We're talking about American mythos here. So, in most of our history, the West has sort of been it was the West, this mythical place where, any man could go out and make a life for himself, slightly away from civilization or on the edge of civilization. And then eventually civilization will catch up and they go, I don't like this stuff. I'm going to move even further out. Um, America itself has a lot of minerals. We have a lot of mines. We have a lot of land, which is very good for growing crops and raising cattle. And so you also have our next term, the allure of land. So again, this idea that, oh wow, I can get land. Of course, now it's very, very difficult to own your own bit of land, and especially getting anything that would be like a farm would be prohibitively expensive if you don't come into any money or you don't inherit a farm, because a lot of land has been bought up by businesses and things like that. But again, this is at a time where land wasn't necessarily owned by anybody. In fact, most of it was not owned by anybody or was run by the government or claimed by Native Americans. So, and of course, we don't care about the Native Americans and what they want, so we're just going to go take their land anyway, which is unfortunately what we did, even though we had treaties and things that said we weren't going to do that. Um, and so many start moving west looking for better lives. Of course, you have the gold rushes, which I mentioned in places like Oregon and Washington serve as places where there's like paradise. Oh, you have this lovely, cool temperatures and lots of trees and resources on the coast. Of course, this allure didn't just work for Americans. This allure got people from all over the world because, In Europe, especially, all the land was already taken, and it's been taken for hundreds of years or thousands of years. The same family has owned the same bit of property for the last 1,000 years, and you're never going to get any land unless you become king or you become really good friends with the king and he gives you a title. So the allure of land brought a lot of people into America, but also help is one of the reasons we kept moving further and further west. The Homestead Act is probably one of the biggest things we've ever done as a country. We basically just gave away a huge amount of land to anybody who would go live in it. Because again, this is an area where nobody was living. You had Native Americans who would migrate and were nomadic and would move throughout the plains in the West, chasing buffalo and things like that. And so basically, if you were a male citizen or an immigrant who was becoming a citizen, you get 160 acres of land. No, it wasn't necessarily going to be great land, and you have to get out there on your own, and you have to build a farm on it and a home, and you have to stay there for 5 years, which is a deal that probably a lot of people would take, and unfortunately, a lot of these people were not successful, but a lot were, and it brought hundreds of thousands of people to the plains. For example, when it was passed, there was only 100, there was only 10,000 farms in Kansas, but just 2 decades later, there's over 200,000 farms in Kansas. These were completely unspoiled territory. There's no grocery stores. There's no Home Depot where you can go buy things for your house. You have to build everything from scratch, and you can only have what you can bring on your covered wagon. And so, if I don't know if many of you have been to Kansas or been to the plains, it's kind of flat. There's not a lot there, including trees. And so, a lot of these people were forced to live in sod houses, which is basically dirt. Make a house out of dirt and then go out and farm every day. So it was tough life, and there wasn't always a lot of access to water, to irrigation. So you have to have dry farming. So it was very, very hard work. There's a reason why I think less than half actually were successful at creating a farm. Our next term, independent Indians. These, again, as our country develops, as our country grows, we are constantly moving further, further out. And what is really not great for Native Americans is the fact that we keep going, okay, we're going to take this land that belonged to you. I know this is your land, it's your ancestral land. You've lived here for 1,000 years, but we want it now. We're going to move in, okay? You're just going to move you further out. Just move a little bit further west, it'll be fine. And I promise we will let you have that land forever. We won't take it from you. And then actually, oh wait, no, actually we do need this land. Can you move a little bit further out? And then eventually it becomes, we're going to kick Native Americans out of everywhere that's not Oklahoma. Well, it's not Oklahoma yet, but it will become Oklahoma. And so by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, after the Civil War, there are no Native Americans on the area west of the Mississippi. Right? Before the Civil War even gets started, there are no Native Americans left east of the Mississippi. They've all been moved west of the Mississippi on reservations, and pretty much none of them are left on the lands, on their ancestral lands, except for a few of the larger nomadic tribes like the Comanche, the Apache. But again, we kept taking more and more land away from them. We kept telling them that, we will respect your territory. We will let you even have your own government and your own rules. And then, oh, never mind. We're actually just going to take away all your independence, and we're going to take away your land. And there are a few that are like, you know what, we don't need you. Mainly the Comanche, the Apache, who were nomadic and living on the plains. And they were one of the main things they were living off of was buffalo, which they hunted. And buffalo used to migrate in massive herds across the plains, thousands and thousands and thousands of buffalo and bison. And so the federal government decided, well, if this is how Native Americans are living and they're doing and they're living this way to be independent from us, we're just going to kill all the buffalo. And so they did. pretty much. Nearly hunted the American bison to extinction. And as a result, these Native Americans that had been, again, independent for 10,000 years suddenly had to move on to a reservation where they were constantly relying on the United States for food, for supplies, for resources. And we were not really good at that either, unfortunately. We weren't good at taking care of these Native Americans who are supposed to be in our care. On this slide, you can see some advertisements. Go west, come to Nebraska. We have a lot of corn. That's not what they were saying now, but that's certainly what a Nebraskan would say now. Um, you also have an image of a sod house on the top right. Again, when I say there's nothing there in the plains, there's nothing. You have dirt and you have grass. Good luck. But some are successful, like this picture in the middle. This is a farm in the Great Plains. It's a great place to raise cattle as long as you have a lot of land to move around. They can literally just eat the grass, and that's enough for them. And then you can take them. And when the railroad comes, it's really good because then you can sell them for meat. And then you have an image of a buffalo hunt. If you didn't know what a buffalo is, they are massive, heavy, heavy, huge creatures. If you ever see one out in the wild, don't pet them. They will crush you. And we slaughtered them in their thousands, nearly to extinction. And this is an image of some buffalo skulls that were added up. This is like 20 years after um, even the Civil War. This is at the end of the century. At this point, we have again nearly hunted the bison to extinction. Unfortunately, all these Native American tribes that have lived off the bison for 10,000 years have to give up being independent and have to move into reservations under our care. And then again, the really bad thing about this is we didn't even like use the buffalo for meat. We literally just killed as many of them as we could so that the Native Americans couldn't. And then eventually, of course, all that's left after a while is the bones. And in this instance, we are gathering literally thousands of them to be turned into fertilizer. That was one of America's many sins during this period. It's certainly not our only one. Though, going back in time just a little bit, we have a couple of wars with natives. This one, the Dakota War or the Sioux Uprising. You have Sioux natives. These are Native Americans living in areas like modern day Minnesota. Eventually, after many people move into Minnesota, Minnesota becomes a state. They go from 6,000 white settlers to over 150,000. And the Sioux realize we're about to be pushed out, like all of the other Native Americans have, and so we're going to fight back, and that leads to a lot of tension, and then eventually they just decide to basically go and start killing. The whole thing lasts about 5 weeks, and they will kill hundreds of white settlers, and thousands will flee the violence. Before a U.S. militia army comes in and takes them out. This is going to be during the first year of the Civil War. And as a result, 303 Dakota warriors will be sentenced to death, although Lincoln will commute most of their sentences. But 38 of them will be hung at once in the largest mass hanging in our history. And also, as a result, the Dakota will lose all of their land and they will be kicked out onto reservations into Nebraska and the Dakotas. So they'll lose all their land in Minnesota. The next one, the Sand Creek Massacre. This happens with the group of Native Americans known as the Cheyenne and the Arapahoes. So again, this is around the time of the Civil War. Natives are living in Colorado, and we're like, hey, we want to go to California. That's where the gold is, and then Oregon is apparently this beautiful, wonderful place. And so you have all these settlers trying to travel through, and so they sign these treaties. And of course, like every treaty with Native Americans, we go, yes, of course we'll respect your land, and yes, of course you live here. Oh, wait, we find gold. And so hundreds of thousands of settlers moved to Colorado, and eventually they're trying to decide, should we listen? Should we listen to them and sign another treaty? And of course, some of them are like, absolutely not. They always break their treaties. They already broken the treaty we signed with them the first time. And of course, they know that there's a chance they could be moved onto reservations. And so a Cheyenne chief takes his group to go visit outside of Denver, Colorado. And there's already fighting going on between the natives and settlers. And unfortunately, a group of 700 American militiamen will open fire and kill about 200 men, women, and children. Because he wasn't traveling with an army, he wasn't traveling with a group of warriors. He was literally just his whole tribe was with him, and they wiped out 200 of them. Um, this is, again, one of many times where disagreements between natives and settlers will lead to violence that usually results in the death of hundreds of settlers or hundreds of Native Americans and them losing their land to settlers. So in the top left, you have the image of the mass hanging, again, where the 33 Dakota warriors were killed. You have the chief and this meeting where he was coming to negotiate and unfortunately uh, massacred. And this is painted by Native Americans after the massacre. On the top left, you can see the mass hanging of Dakota warriors, again, the largest mass hanging in American history. And the bottom right, you can see the Sand Creek Massacre. And the left, you can see a meeting between the natives and them to write the first treaty that eventually we would break. Another couple of instances of disagreements and fights with native come. One of them is our next term, the Long Walk and the Treaty of Bosco Redondo. The Navajo tribe was forcibly removed from their territory, even though we told them we would not make them do that. And unfortunately, when they arrived at the reservations, they were forced to make these long marches. And by the time they arrived, many of them died from malnutrition and disease on on the reservations. Also, when you go from an area where you're allowed to take care of yourself and live for yourself, and now you're completely reliant on them, on the government in this instance, to take care of you, unfortunately, they did not do a good job of that and gave them expired rations and not enough to actually sustain themselves. And so in 1868, General Shepherd will visit the reservation and ends up signing the Treaty of Bosco Redondo in June of 1868. This is one of the few times where we allow them to return to their homeland. So the Navajo are able to return to their homeland. Our next term, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. Chief Joseph was basically refused to bow down to the Americans at first. And so he had this great idea to flee north because he did not want to go into a reservation. And their homeland is in the Pacific Northwest, so Canada, Oregon, close to Washington, those areas. And so they go on 1,000-mile, basically march or run to try to make it to Canada and escape the U.S. cavalry. And they get into a bunch of skirmishes, and then unfortunately, the cavalry will eventually stop them, and Chief Joseph, their leader, is forced to surrender. And he gives this is very eloquent speech. We are tired, we are exhausted, we can go no further, and We just want to be on our own. We just, and this transcript actually goes fairly like popular. Like it becomes incredibly well read throughout the country, and he becomes basically a celebrity in the 1800s. And thanks to his celebrity, he is eventually able to get his natives' land back for a while, and they're able to go home. Um, Again, as we are expanding west, we need to constantly increase access to resources, and we need to be able to access the things that we're building and we're getting in the west. So whether that is cattle or gold, copper, silver, iron, anything that we are able to mine, we need to be able to get it to our factories and to our cities in the east. And so we start building railroads, and railroads are very, very expensive to build, especially because in the beginning you have to be perfectly level. Our original trains were not very good at going up steep hills. And so the government will step in and give a lot of capital, which is money, to these railroad companies and allow them to take basically a lot of land in exchange for building these railroads. So these companies will build a railroad, and the government will give them some land, and then every once in a while they'll create some little town or stop. And after the railroads are built far enough out, that gives access to the farmers, the ranchers, the people living in those areas to gain access to the railroad. So they get access to not only all the resources and benefits of being connected to the East Coast, but also they can begin to sell their stuff to the railroad, who can then go and sell it back in the East. And so you go from everywhere having to take months and months and months in a covered wagon and being incredibly difficult to, as it says here, annihilating time and space and making travel so much faster than ever before. And the thing that basically is the biggest project of this is the Transcontinental Railroad. The West is a purely railroad enterprise. This is the reason why the West is a thing, is because of the railroad, is this big idea. And so the government helps fund this thing, and also private capital helps fund what's known as the Transcontinental Railroad, um, designed to connect the far west of California and Oregon and Washington and Colorado to our big cities in the east. And so you get the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And on one side, you have a bunch of Chinese workers who are coming over from China to work on the railroad. A bunch of them had come over for the gold rush, but when the gold rush ended, they were just kind of left there. And these are unfortunately a bunch of Chinese men. They didn't bring a lot of, very few women came over. They didn't really have a lot to do. They would work for a lot less money than white people. And so it led to a lot of competition for labor. And this was seen as a way to get them out. And you have a similar thing happening on the East Coast because the Irish um, were also coming over in large numbers to the US due to the Irish potato famine. And they needed some work. And the Irish were not well accepted in the East and treated as second class citizens. And so the railroad gave both groups a chance to go out and work. And you have Irish immigrants making up the majority of workers on the eastern half and Chinese workers on the western half. And eventually they will meet in the middle in Utah. And this was a big thing pushed by Republicans. And eventually, railroad companies will get 175 million acres that they will use to help pay for these railroad tracks. And they will use to build towns and things like that in order to make it worthwhile. But this completely changes the way that our country works and lives. So looking at our images, you have Chief Joseph and the nearest pieces at the top left. Again, like I said, a minor celebrity at the time. You have several images of the railroads. You have this on the in the center. You have a railroad town being built again. These would sort of pop up every once in a while where the railroad companies thought it would be useful. And slowly it would begin to build out and get more and more resources and more buildings and become full-fledged towns and cities. That's how places like Dallas really grew. Once the railroad came to this tiny little town, it turned into the big, massive urban center that Dallas is today. Houston, Chicago. Chicago became one of the biggest cities because it is the place where all railroads converge is in Chicago. You also have Denver, being connected by railroad is also very, very important. These railroad workers were sometimes subject to Native American raids, which is what you can see in the bottom right. And the picture at the very top is where the two railroads met. So this was a big day where the East and the West finally met, and the Transcontinental Railroad was done. And then it would just continue to grow, and we'd continue to build more tracks all over the country. And as I mentioned, this of course leads to the rise of Chicago. Now that it's connected the East and the Great Lakes, so a lot of boats are going to be going across the Great Lakes, and that's a lot of cargo travels across the Great Lakes. And now, because you have access to the entire West, you also get a great deal from there. As I said in the previous slide, you have the rise of Chicago is our next term. It's an incredibly important railroad hub. So you have all the Western railroads originally go to Chicago, and it will go from a town of 200 to a town of over a million in less than a century, reaching a million by 1890, which is why Chicago is still one of the largest cities in the US. It is the gateway between the eastern markets, the Great Plains, and all the farms of the ranch. It's where all the cattle is slaughtered and turned into meat. And it is where a lot of the resources that come in from the West uh, enter into our industrial capacity. So, one of the biggest things that comes about in the Western culture, of course, is cattle drives. So, cowboys will take massive herds of cattle. They will travel around, they will eat for food for a while until they're ready to be, slaughter weight. And then they'll be driven from lands in Texas all the way up to this transcontinental railroad, where they will be loaded onto trains and taken to Chicago, where they'll be slaughtered and put into meat and be sold. And again, this is at a time when most of the West is still unclaimed and a lot of people haven't taken over the land. And so they can basically just roam free and eat all the grass that they want. As I mentioned, railroads reached Dallas in 1872. You have the Fort Worth stockyards becoming a lot more important. And then cattle drives aren't as necessary because you don't have to travel across three states to get to the railroads. Also, you have barbed wire, which is an invention that comes in at the end of that century. And again, people begin to they begin to cordon off their land because they don't want you coming in with your livestock and eating their crops and eating their food and eating their resources. And they also want to keep their livestock contained so they don't get away, they don't get stolen as easily, and are protected from predators. And so barbed wire and the expansion of the railroad. The railroad is what starts cattle drives, but also will be, as it expands, it will help end cattle drives because they no longer need to go nearly as far. And next you have the Dawes Act. So again, as I've said, we've been working to greatly reduce the amount of land Native Americans have. And at this point, they basically only have some lands in the West, nothing east of the Mississippi anymore. And in 1887, there is this idea that, well, Native Americans are just living on reservations and having to rely on us for food and for everything they need. So why don't we just make them be like us? Why don't we just make them farmers? And so we'll give them individual family homesteads, and then they can learn to be farmers and Americans like us. There's this really big idea that they're going to assimilate. So that's one of those words that's really big in this sort of this century, is that if you're going to live in America, whether you're an immigrant coming from another country or you're a Native American, you need to be like us. You need to give up your ways and become like Americans. And not surprisingly, not many of them wanted to do that. we were we tried to tout this as a good thing. Look at what we're doing for the Native Americans. We're helping them become more like us. But in reality, of course, it's just trying to enforce our way of life on them. And so a lot of them did not take the land, and what ended up happening is they ended up losing a lot of land because it would just get, after a number of years, it was just able to be sold, and so it would all be bought up. And so it actually ends up taking away a lot of Native American reservation land. Very few of them end up taking up that farmer lifestyle. And what's more is, at this point, natives have no sovereignty left. They have no ability to run their own courts, their own trials, have any sort of representation. And at this point, Native Americans aren't even citizens of the United States. They can't vote. So if you're living on a reservation, it's really, really not very nice, is the easiest way I can put it. It is unfortunately one of many things that we do to the Native Americans that is solely for our benefit and ignores theirs and their desires and their needs. And it's something that we have a lot of instances of and a lot to make up for. And there's no easy answer on how to do that. On these images, you can see Capitol Woods Museum. This is early images of Chicago. Chicago exploded in size and population. It was built in a very kind of swampy area. Eventually, they'll have to raise Chicago on wooden platforms to get it to where it would stop flooding. And then they had all other problems with industrial waste and things like that. Again, you have a cattle drive up in the top right. Again, cowboys would take these heads of cattle. Most cowboys, despite cultural depictions, were mostly vaqueros, and so they were Hispanic. There's also a great number of African American cowboys, but most cowboys were not anything like you see in our cultural depictions. John Wayne was only a cowboy in Hollywood. He was not an actual cowboy, nor did he look anything like an actual cowboy. And our last image is the Dawes Act, which is pretty self-explanatory. Again, you have this guy literally carving up um, Native American lands, which is what happened with the Dawes Act. So, again, Native Americans have been losing more and more and more as time goes on, and they're going to listen to anybody who tells them that it will get better. And a prophet comes up with this vision, and he's a Northern Paiute called Wakova, and he sees this vision, which is he calls the ghost dance, and basically says, if enough Native Americans do this goat dance, then the droughts would end that are making it even harder for Native Americans to live on these reservations. Their ancestors would rise from the dead, buffalo would return, and the white people would vanish from the West. And again, they were so desperate because of this colonization, conquest, and forced assimilation that they would turn to prophets and holy men for any sort of guidance and comfort. And so this was adopted by many tribes like the Sioux and the Lakota. We already talked about the Sioux losing theirs, losing a bunch of territory. The Lakota had territory in South Dakota. They had lost a bunch of their land and they were starving after the federal government reduced rations again. Hey, we're going to get rid of all the stuff you used to live, and then you're going to take care of you. Oh, we're going to not give you enough food. And so many of them begin doing this ghost dance. And again, the hope is to connect with ancestors. It's a very spiritual thing, an act of desperation in many instances. And it is caught up in American media and reported. And again, this is a time where Native Americans occasionally rise up and kill white settlers. And so it sparks a lot of fear. And in response, the American military basically kind of steps in. And during a disagreement, you have one of the most famous Indian chiefs in the entire country, a man named Sitting Bull, who is a Lakota chief, is killed in a botched arrest attempt. And after this sensationalized the ghost dance, after the ghost dance is something that has a lot of white people, especially in the West, very scared of what's going to happen. And in response, many Lakota flee the reservations and become fugitives in the West, trying to get away from American control, try to get away from the West, and try to get away from this control and forced assimilation. But as has happened in the past, eventually the U.S. cavalry catches up with them, and they will intercept a group of about 350 Lakota men, women, and children, including about 100 of them are women and children. They are escorted back towards their lands. They camp at the night at a place called Wounded Knee. And their chief at the time is named Spotted Elk. And in the morning of December 29th, 1890, cavalry officers will enter the camp and try to disarm Spotted Elk and his warrior band. And eventually, like in the past, it leads to some fighting. And eventually, the cavalry opens fire and kills many men, women, and children, anywhere from 150 to 300. We don't know exactly how many they killed because they did not keep very good records of this. And this is going to be the last time that there is major Native American resistance in the plains. This is basically breaks the back of Native American resistance just through our sheer brutality and constant forcing them to assimilate and give up what they have. And now there are no independent Native Americans left. They're all living on reservations, all under uh, U.S. control, basically. Not that that means we'll leave them alone. We'll force them into Indian schools and do lots of other terrible things. Here's a couple images of the top two images are of the ghost dance, and you have a couple of the Wounded Knee massacres. The image of the Wounded Knee massacre on the left, and another ghost dance painting on the bottom right. As I've sort of alluded to throughout this, of course, in our culture, the West is something that is very different from our actual history of the West. We have glamorized it, mythized it, mythologized it, which is something that Americans love to do with our history. And the West is something that is very, very important in American history. And though Westerns don't get a lot of traction today, at one time, half of the movies that were produced were Westerns. And this had such a huge part of American history, especially in the early 20th century and well into the late 20th century. This sort of cowboy culture really took on. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys are named for the Cowboys. You have a lot of Western cowboy mythos that is mixed in with everything. The way that it sort of enters the mythos is around the Civil War. You begin to have what's known as a dime novel. It literally cost a dime. A short story, usually about some Native American saving people from train robbers or from, attack of Native Americans, something like that. Something where the cowboy is the hero of the story, and you get some very famous people like Calamity Jane and Billy the Kid, Buffalo Bill, some of the most famous cowboy heroes of legend. And they were brave, courageous, and had a rough exterior and could, handle things, but also were kind and generous and would help the needy and save, the damsel in distress sort of thing. They were these heroes saving civilization, which is, of course, very different from what an actual cowboy was, because what cowboys actually did was work with cows, and that's about it. So you do get Wild West shows, which is our next term. These are national. These are traveling shows. The first of them were basically like, here's kind of what life is like on the West. Here's what Native Americans dress like, and here's, some paintings of Native Americans. And then the first guy who kind of started the Wild West shows, George Catlin, basically he started off as a lecture series, and then he invited Native Americans to set up a village in New York, and people would come and pay money to look and see it like a real Native American village. And then it traveled over to Europe and was very, very, very popular there. And then eventually his show was bought by the most famous cowboy in American history at the time. His name was Buffalo Bill, or William Cody, who was a Civil War veteran in Kansas, whose stories were sold to dime novels and became very, very famous. And he really took it to it became a traveling show all across the U.S. And it was called the unofficial entertainment of the U.S. from 1890 to 1910. For 20 years, he would travel around the country, and he was always the hero. He was always the cowboy that would ride in at the end and save everybody. Even when he could no longer ride a horse, he'd come in a stagecoach with a wig on because he'd gone bald. Like it was a spectacle, and it was a lot of fun. And he also never called it a show. He didn't like the idea of a show. It was Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And he would use real life cowboys and real life Indians as a show. Uh, one of the reasons why Sitting Bull, who I mentioned earlier, was such a famous chief, is because he actually participated in some of these Wild West entertainment um, shows. And one of the most famous people in Buffalo Bill's traveling Wild West show, besides himself, was his female sharpshooter, Annie Oakley, also known as Little Sure Shot. She used to do a lot of tips and tricks with things on horseback, on with a gun. She was, again, a really, really good sharpshooter. A lot of these shows had cavalrymen, sharpshooters, Indians, Rangers, that sort of thing, who would again entertain the crowd in one way or another. And you have in this image, you have a couple. You have an advertisement for Buffalo Bill's Wild West. You have Sitting Bull uh, killing Buffalo Bill. In this image on the left, this is a redo of Custer's Last Stand, where Sitting Bull is taking the place of the Indian who killed Custer. Of course, he was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and also sometimes called Custer's Last Stand. And there you have, on the top, you have an image of that's Annie Oakley, um, very talented young woman, and some more images of him and Sitting Bull and advertisements from his traveling entertainment. And our last slide, our last term, is the frontier thesis. So this is one of the first real American historians. This guy, his name is Frederick Jackson Turner. And he's the one who really set up this idea of the frontier, the West being this important idea in American history. And he comes up with what's called the frontier thesis. And he gives this presentation in 1890 called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he claimed that the frontier is what set America apart from the stale monarchies of Europe. Because again, where everything in Europe was stagnant and has been stagnant for hundreds of years, land has been owned by the same families for a long time, only changing hands in war. And unless you were born into the upper class, you really had no chance for advancement. Where literally anyone, he said, in America could go and get land and become make something of themselves and become successful. And There was this, the frontier served as the border between savagery and civilization, and anybody who like didn't quite fit in could go to the frontier and make a life for themselves and help expand civilization. And then it was sort of a pressure valve for American society. And he was lamenting it because in 1890, the Census Bureau basically declared that all the land in America had been claimed, the frontier was closed, there was no unspoiled land anymore. And so Turner was lamenting this, and he helped start uh, an entire school of thought and of American history about the West, because he believed that it was the West and the frontier that gave America its democratic spirit and our rugged individualism, which is such an important part, where we have always wanted to do things on our own and we wanted to do things our way. And Americans don't like being told what to do because we are so used to this independence and doing things on our own. Best way to get, an American not to do something is to tell them to do it, that sort of thing. So, or conversely, tell them they're not going to do it. Americans are always going to do what they want. And that's something that he said, that rugged individualism is something that he said came because we came and we conquered this continent, and we had always been able to do whatever we needed and been able to expand. And he was again lamenting that was gone. So that is the end of this module, again about the rebuilding of the country, bringing us back together after the Civil War, and America fully reaching its manifest destiny and taking over the continent that we had arrived at in the 1600s, sort of believing it to be this unspoiled place and infinite possibility. And now that infinite possibility was gone, it had been finite, actually. And what are we going to do next? Well, I guess that's a topic for next time.